After a news conference that was neither a rousing success nor an unmitigated disaster, Democrats are left wondering today what to do about Joe Biden. For a growing number of congressional Democrats, the answer is to call for him to end his reelection campaign. There are now 17 elected Democrats publicly urging him to step aside as the nominee. Prominent Representative Jim Himes joined that list a short time after Biden's Q&A session with reporters. Biden's high-stakes news conference showcased his ability to speak expansively about the economy, foreign affairs, but it also included one notable flub, which came right after a verbal stumble earlier in the day. Listen.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there.
All right, Biden reiterated he has no plans to drop out of the race. He also spoke about his admiration for his vice president, Kamala Harris, amid calls for her to replace him at the top of the ticket.
First of all, the way she's handled the issue of freedom of women's bodies to have control over their bodies. Secondly, her ability to handle almost any issue on the board. This was a hell of a prosecutor. She was a first-rate person, and in the Senate, she was really good. I wouldn't have picked her unless I thought she was qualified to be president. From the very beginning, I made no bones about that. She is qualified to be president. That's why I picked her.
All right, we're going to cover all of these many angles, and let's begin with CNN's Lauren Fox in Washington, D.C. She's tracking the reaction from Democrats in Congress. So right now, 17 elected members who say he should step aside. What happens with that list as the day grows?
Yeah, that list has nearly doubled since 24 hours ago, and 3 of those additions came last night after this press conference, including the top Democrat, Jim Himes, who just moments after the conclusion of this press conference tweeted out his statement saying that he thought that Joe Biden should step aside, that he should usher in a new generation of candidates in the Democratic Party and give people an opportunity to run for president in his stead. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that there were a number of Democrats who I talked to last night who felt as though President Biden performed very well, who were happy to see that he did not have the kind of performance he had at the debate, but many of them also warning in the same breath that they are concerned it wasn't a strong enough performance to perhaps stem the tide overall. And I think that that is a consistent theme that colleagues at CNN are hearing. You know, one thing to keep an eye on today is, does this number continue to grow? Does it continue to grow into the weekend? At some point, I think Democrats are hoping that the focus turns to Republicans next week at the Republican convention. But you know, one thing you heard from Jim Himes was essentially this idea that it has now been 2 weeks, and he's concerned that people are still talking about the president's fitness for office. And in some ways, it's not something that you can easily put to bed, because every high-profile moment, whether it's a press conference or a meeting in the Oval Office that's televised or a discussion with his Democratic colleagues, people are going to be watching very closely for every comment, every stumble, every potential flub. And I think that that is a problem for Democrats going forward. They are acknowledging that, and one of their concerns is that the longer this drags on, the harder it is to change momentum or direction. Now, it's worth noting, this is still only 17 Democrats of hundreds, right? And I think that that is an important thing to caveat here. But it is just also worth noting that this isn't going away for Democrats. Every hallway I was in over the course of the last week, every meeting I was staking out, reporters were asking over and over again whether or not Democrats were supporting their candidate. And this is an uncomfortable moment for them. You know, Democrats met yesterday behind closed doors with Biden campaign officials at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. And while a lot of members were really mum coming out of that meeting, my colleague Mani Raju and I reported that there was a very frank, serious, and sometimes emotional discussion behind closed doors. And senators are being very careful. There's only one senator, Democrat Peter Welch, who has come out publicly and said that Biden should not be the candidate running for office at this moment, but others have expressed concerns that he can't win in November. And behind closed doors, we're told that those discussions were really serious yesterday. Frederica?
All right, Lauren Fox, keep us posted throughout the day. Thanks so much.
Joining me now, Democratic strategist Keith Boykin and CNN political commentator Kristen Soltis Anderson. It's great to see you guys. Keith, last night you watched, you slept, you woke up, now thinking what about Joe Biden's candidacy?
I feel much better about Joe Biden's candidacy today than I did yesterday. He had a strong performance at the press conference last night. I think the poll numbers that have come out recently are also indicative of the fact that he's doing better. ABC News Washington Post poll shows him tied with Donald Trump. The new NPR poll shows him ahead of Donald Trump. And on top of that, Joe Biden has had maybe 24 campaign appearances in the past couple of weeks. He's shown himself to be a vigorous campaigner. No, he's not 60-year-old or 50-year-old Joe Biden. He's an 81-year-old Joe Biden. He's a lot slower than he was before. He's not as effective as a campaigner as he was before, but he clearly has a command of the issues. And Democrats need to stop this whining and start fighting against Donald Trump, who is a convicted criminal, who is behind or responsible for or going to implement Project 2025. That's what we should be talking about as Republicans are going into their convention next week in Milwaukee, not about Joe Biden and his debate performance 2 weeks ago.
Kristen, your initial take last night made me smile. Your candor, so refreshing to bring everyone up to speed who may have missed it, and you shouldn't have. You said, as a pollster, I'm very uncomfortable with the level of importance that is being placed on our industry right now. I mean, there was a lot of talk from Biden and honestly from Chris Coons this morning and from other elected Democrats about polling. From Biden, how the polls are wrong, have been wrong, how the polls tell him now that voters want him to stay in the race, and how the polls do not show that Kamala Harris would do better than him against Donald Trump. That's from Biden last night. Talk to me.
What unbelievable pressure it would be right now to be Joe Biden's pollster when he stands up at the NATO summit and says, the only thing that will drive me from the race is if my pollster comes to me and says I can't win. Unbelievable pressure. And I frankly think that we are putting too much importance on polls right now. I say this as someone who works in this industry. Joe Biden should decide if he can serve another 4 years as president. Can he do the job and execute it well? And he has come to that conclusion. I don't know if I agree with that conclusion. I don't feel as reassured. In setting aside everything about the election, just the fact that Joe Biden is still the president, I don't feel as reassured after yesterday's press conference. It really was a Rorschach test, right? If you like Joe Biden and you want him to stay in, you can say, look, he stood for 60 minutes and answered questions. I think that's kind of a low bar, but if you don't like Joe Biden, you can point to the many slip-ups, the calling Kamala Harris Vice President Trump and so on and so forth, and say, look, he has lost his fastball. Democrats are running out of time. They have no risk strategies. Stick with Biden. You have the risk that something is going to happen like that debate again over the course of the next 4 months. And you have time to really recover. But there is also a risk of switching gears, going to another candidate. Now, in the polling, Kamala Harris actually does about as well as Joe Biden. That could, of course, change as more Americans get form stronger opinions about her. But this race is really static right now, and it is much less about do I like Joe Biden or do I like Donald Trump? But it's more about how much do I dislike the other candidate? And that is what has made this so that the polls, even with that disastrous debate performance, just don't move that much.